September 23, 1944. Somewhere in the French countryside near Luxembourg, a German reconnaissance pilot circles high above what appears to be a massive American armored division preparing for an offensive. He counts the tanks through his binoculars. Dozens of Sherman tanks arranged in tactical formations, artillery pieces positioned for fire support, half-tracks and supply vehicles clustered in staging areas, radio antennas bristling from command posts. This is exactly the kind of intelligence his commanders need. The Americans are clearly preparing for a major attack in this sector, which means German forces need to be repositioned immediately to counter the threat. The pilot completes his surveillance run and returns to base. Within hours, German High Command is rerouting 2 full divisions to defend against the American buildup. Thousands of German soldiers are being moved. Artillery batteries are being repositioned. The entire German defensive strategy for that section of the front is being rewritten based on what that pilot saw. Except there's a problem. There are no American tanks in that field. There are no artillery pieces. There are no half-tracks or supply vehicles. What the German pilot photographed from 3,000 feet was the most elaborate con job in military history. Those tanks are made of inflatable rubber. The artillery pieces are painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. The half-tracks are old trucks with fake armor panels bolted on, and the soldiers moving between these fake vehicles aren't combat troops. They're artists, designers, sound engineers, and advertising executives playing the role of an army that doesn't exist. This is the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the most classified unit in the United States Army during World War II. They're officially listed as a routine headquarters unit doing logistics and communications work. In reality, there's something that sounds too crazy to be real. They're a traveling theater company whose stage is the battlefield and whose audience is the German military. Their mission is simple in concept but almost impossible in execution. Create fake armies out of thin air. Make the Germans believe those fake armies are real. And while the Germans are busy repositioning forces to counter threats that don't exist, the real American units will attack somewhere else. It's military deception on a scale that has never been attempted before, and it's being orchestrated by men whose previous jobs involved designing department store window displays and painting billboard advertisements. The Ghost Army, as they'll eventually be known, begins with a problem that's plaguing Allied commanders throughout 1943 and early 1944. The Allies are trying to plan major offensives against German forces in Europe, but they're facing an enemy that still has significant strength and excellent defensive capabilities. Every time the Allies mass forces for an attack, German reconnaissance spots the buildup and German commanders shift their reserves to counter it. The result is that Allied offensives keep running into prepared defenses, leading to high casualties and slow progress. What the Allies need is a way to hide their real intentions while making the Germans think attacks are coming from places they're not. The British have been experimenting with military deception for years, using dummy tanks and fake installations to fool German aerial reconnaissance in North Africa. Some of their tricks worked spectacularly. Before the Battle of El Alamein, British forces created an entire fake water pipeline that took weeks to build, making the Germans think the British offensive couldn't possibly come for months because they were still building their logistics infrastructure. Meanwhile, the real attack came much sooner from a completely different direction. American military planners studied these British successes and started thinking bigger. What if instead of just creating a few fake installations, they created entire fake armies? What if they could make the Germans believe whole divisions were in places they weren't? The problem was that creating a convincing fake army required skills the regular military didn't have. You needed artists who could design camouflage that looked real from the air. You needed engineers who could build fake equipment that would fool aerial photography. You needed sound technicians who could create audio recordings of tanks and trucks that sounded authentic. You needed communications experts who could generate fake radio traffic that matched how real headquarters would operate. In short, you needed creative professionals, not soldiers. So the army did something unusual. They started recruiting from art schools, advertising agencies, design studios, and anywhere else they could find people with the right creative skills. The recruitment was deliberately vague. Young men were approached and asked if they'd be interested in special duty that would use their artistic talents. They couldn't be told what the work actually involved because the entire program was classified at the highest levels. Many of them assumed they'd be doing propaganda posters or camouflage design. Instead, they found themselves assigned to a unit that was about to become the most elaborate deception operation in American military history. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially activated in January 1944. Its roster read like a who's who of the American art world: fashion designers, commercial artists, radio actors, sound engineers, set designers from Broadway, advertising illustrators. These were not people you'd normally find in a combat unit. The man who designed the Lucky Strike cigarette logo was in the Ghost Army. A future famous fashion designer who would dress first ladies was in the Ghost Army. Artists who would go on to have paintings hanging in major museums were in the Ghost Army. They were given basic infantry training, just enough to teach them how to salute properly and not shoot themselves with their service rifles. And then they were shipped to England in the spring of 1944 to prepare for the invasion of France. Most of them still had no real idea what they were going to be doing. The equipment that arrived for their use was unlike anything these men had seen. Inflatable tanks made of rubberized canvas that could be carried by 4 men and inflated with air compressors in about 15 minutes. When properly inflated and positioned, these fake tanks looked completely real from more than 100 yards away. From the air, they were nearly impossible to distinguish from actual Sherman tanks. The unit also received fake artillery pieces made of lightweight materials, dummy vehicles, and an entire mobile sound laboratory mounted in specially modified trucks. This sound equipment could play recordings of tank engines, truck convoys, and construction noises at volumes that could be heard for miles. The Ghost Army landed in France a few weeks after D-Day and immediately went to work. Their first operation was near Normandy, where they were tasked with making the Germans believe an American armored division was positioned in an area where it actually wasn't. The Ghost Army set up their inflatable tanks in fields, positioned them in tactical formations, and then added all the small details that would sell the deception. They hung laundry on lines near the fake tanks. They drove trucks around the area creating tire tracks. They set up fake command posts with radio antennas. And at night they played recordings of tank maintenance noises, the sounds of engines being repaired, of metal clanking, of soldiers shouting orders. From a distance, it sounded exactly like a real armored unit, but the visual and audio deception was only part of the operation. The Ghost Army also had a signals intelligence component that was crucial to selling the illusion. Radio operators would broadcast fake communications using the call signs and codes that a real armored division would use. They'd send routine traffic reports, weather updates, supply requisitions, all the mundane communications that real military units generate constantly. German signals intelligence units listening to Allied radio traffic would hear exactly what they expected to hear from an American armored division. The combination of visual, audio, and radio deception created an illusion that was incredibly difficult for the Germans to see through. The Ghost Army's operations required meticulous attention to detail and a kind of creativity that regular military units couldn't provide. Before each mission, the deception specialists would study how real units behaved. They'd observe actual tank battalions to see how they positioned their vehicles, where they placed their maintenance areas, how their soldiers moved around the camp. Then they'd replicate all of those details with their fake equipment. They even created fake shoulder patches for different divisions and would wear them when they went into nearby towns, making sure locals and potential German spies would report seeing soldiers from specific units in the area. One of their most critical operations came in September 1944 during the Allied advance across France. The 9th Army was planning a major crossing of the Moselle River, a dangerous operation that would require concentrating significant forces at the crossing point. The problem was that such a concentration would be obvious to German reconnaissance, and the Germans would mass forces to oppose the crossing. The Ghost Army was tasked with making the Germans think the 9th Army was going to cross the river at a completely different location, 15 miles south of the actual crossing site. The Ghost Army moved into position near the fake crossing site and created an elaborate deception. They set up inflatable tanks and fake artillery positions. They broadcast radio traffic indicating a major headquarters was operating in the area. They played sound recordings of bridge construction equipment, making it seem like engineers were building crossing points. They even had officers drive into nearby towns wearing 9th Army insignia and loudly discuss the upcoming river crossing in bars and cafes where they knew German intelligence agents were likely to be listening. The deception worked perfectly. German forces reinforced the fake crossing site with artillery and infantry. When the real 9th Army crossed the river 15 miles north, they faced minimal opposition. The Ghost Army's fake army had drawn away the defenders, and the Real crossing succeeded with far fewer casualties than expected. The Ghost Army conducted over 20 major deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany between June 1944 and the end of the war in May 1945. They impersonated entire divisions. They created fake headquarters for armies that didn't exist. They staged elaborate shows designed to convince German intelligence that American forces were planning operations that were never going to happen. And they did all of this while operating just miles from the front lines, often close enough to hear actual combat happening while they were setting up their theatrical productions. The danger they faced was very real despite the theatrical nature of their work. The Ghost Army wasn't a combat unit, but they operated in combat zones. German artillery sometimes targeted the areas where they set up their fake positions. German patrols occasionally stumbled upon their operations. Several Ghost Army soldiers were killed or wounded during their missions. They were armed only with basic infantry weapons and had no real combat support. If they'd been discovered by a serious German attack, they would have been overrun quickly. The men of the Ghost Army were acutely aware that they were operating a con game in one of the most dangerous places on Earth, and if the Germans ever figured out what they were actually doing, the consequences would be severe. The psychological aspect of their work was also unusual. These men were artists and creative professionals who found themselves in a war zone creating elaborate lies. Some of them struggled with the disconnect between their training as artists, where authenticity and truth were valued, and their current job, which was all about creating convincing falsehoods. But most of them came to see their work as a different kind of art, a performance art where the canvas was the battlefield and success meant saving lives. Every German soldier who was repositioned to counter a fake threat was a German soldier who wasn't fighting against real American units. Every successful deception operation meant fewer Americans died in the actual attacks. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Ghost Army was how they maintained their cover. The unit was classified at such a high level that even other American units didn't know what they were doing. When real combat units would encounter the Ghost Army setting up their fake equipment, the deception specialists had to maintain the illusion that they were a real headquarters unit. They couldn't tell other Americans that the tanks were inflatable, or that the whole operation was fake. Sometimes real American units would request support from what they thought was an armored division, only to be told that unit wasn't available, never knowing they were looking at rubber tanks. The Ghost Army had to lie to their own side as convincingly as they lied to the enemy. The technical sophistication of their deception improved throughout the war. The sound effects team developed increasingly realistic recordings. They'd record actual tank battalions and then edit the audio to create extended soundscapes that could play for hours, mixing engine noises with track sounds, radio chatter, and maintenance work. They'd adjust the playback based on terrain and weather because sound travels differently in different conditions. They became experts in acoustic deception, understanding how to use landscape features to project sound toward German listening posts while minimizing what friendly forces would hear. The visual deception team became masters of perspective and scale. They learned exactly how German reconnaissance photography worked and designed their fake installations to look real from the specific angles and altitudes that German aircraft would use. They studied shadows and learned to position their inflatable tanks so the shadows would look correct at the times of day when German reconnaissance flights were most common. They created fake maintenance debris, scattered empty fuel cans and spare parts around their fake vehicles, because real military units are messy and leave evidence of their presence. The radio deception specialists developed elaborate scripts for their fake communications. They'd create entire fictional headquarters staffs with consistent personalities and speech patterns. Operators would stay in character for weeks, maintaining the illusion that there was a real Colonel Smith who always complained about supply problems, or a real Major Johnson who had a distinctive way of phrasing his reports. German signals intelligence operators listening to these transmissions heard consistency and authenticity that reinforced the visual and audio deception. One of the Ghost Army's most ambitious operations came in March 1945 during the Rhine River crossing. This was one of the final major operations of the war in Europe, a massive assault where Allied forces would cross the Rhine and drive into the heart of Germany. The stakes were enormous and the Germans knew that losing the Rhine meant losing the war. The Ghost Army was tasked with Operation Viersen, a deception designed to make the Germans think the Ninth Army was going to cross the Rhine at a different location than the actual crossing site. This wasn't just about moving a few fake tanks around. This required creating the illusion of an entire army corps preparing for a major river assault. The Ghost Army moved into position and created one of their most elaborate shows. They set up hundreds of inflatable tanks and fake artillery pieces. They created mock supply dumps with fake ammunition and fuel storage. They built fake airstrips that looked like they were being prepared for close air support operations. The sound trucks played continuous recordings of construction equipment, tank movements, and military activity. Radio operators broadcast traffic from multiple divisions, and the Ghost Army added a new element to this operation: atmospheric effects. They used smoke generators to create the kind of haze and smoke that would naturally occur around a major military concentration. The smoke from hundreds of vehicles and cooking fires and generators. The deception was so convincing that some Allied units actually believed it. Real American soldiers reported seeing a massive buildup in the Viersen area. Intelligence officers from other units requested information about the units supposedly massing there. The Ghost Army had to maintain their cover even against American scrutiny while simultaneously fooling the Germans. German intelligence fell for it completely. They identified multiple American divisions in the Viersen area and reinforced their defenses there. When the rail crossing came at a different location, it succeeded with surprisingly light casualties because German reserves were positioned to counter a threat that never came. The success rate of Ghost Army operations was remarkably high. Post-war analysis of German intelligence reports and captured documents showed that German commanders consistently fell for the deceptions. They repositioned forces based on Ghost Army illusions. They wasted ammunition bombarding fake positions. They held reserves in areas to counter fake threats while real American attacks came from unexpected directions. Military historians estimate that the Ghost Army's deceptions saved between 10,000 and 30,000 American lives during their operations. That's a staggering number for a unit that never fired a shot in combat. The Ghost Army was disbanded shortly after the end of the war in Europe. The men returned home and were ordered never to speak about what they'd done. The entire operation remained classified for more than 40 years. The soldiers who'd served in the Ghost Army couldn't tell their families or friends about their service. When people asked what they did in the war, they'd give vague answers about being in a headquarters unit or doing logistics work. Many of them went back to their careers in art and design, carrying secrets they couldn't share. It wasn't until the 1980s that the Ghost Army story began to emerge. As documents were declassified and veterans started speaking publicly about their experiences, historians realized what had happened. Here was an entire unit whose service had been erased from public history because the nature of their work was too sensitive to reveal. These men had contributed enormously to Allied victory through one of the most creative and unusual military operations ever conceived, but they'd received almost no recognition because nobody could be told what they'd actually done. The Ghost Army's legacy is fascinating from multiple perspectives. From a military standpoint, they pioneered techniques in deception warfare that are still studied and used today. Modern military deception operations use more sophisticated technology, digital communications, and electronic warfare, but the basic principles are the same ones the Ghost Army developed. Create a convincing illusion. Make the enemy believe it's real. Force them to respond to threats that don't exist. From an artistic perspective, the Ghost Army represents a unique moment where creative professionals were asked to use their skills in service of military objectives, turning art and design into weapons as effective as any tank or rifle. The story also raises interesting questions about the nature of warfare and deception. The Ghost Army succeeded because they understood something fundamental about how humans perceive and interpret information. We see what we expect to see. German reconnaissance pilots expected to see American tanks massing for offensives. So when they saw tank-shaped objects in tactical formations, they reported tanks. German signals intelligence expected to hear American units communicating. So when they intercepted radio traffic that sounded like military communications, they believed it was real. The Ghost Army exploited these expectations, creating illusions that worked because they matched what the enemy was looking for. The men who served in the Ghost Army were an unusual collection of individuals who found themselves in an unusual war doing unusual things. They were artists who became soldiers who became theatrical performers whose stage was the battlefield. They saved thousands of lives not by killing enemy soldiers but by fooling them. They won battles not with superior firepower but with superior creativity. And they did all of this while maintaining one of the most successful classified operations of the entire war, staying secret for decades after the war ended. Today, the Ghost Army is finally getting recognition for their contributions. Museums have exhibited their equipment and artwork. Documentaries have told their story. Veterans of the unit have been honored for their service. But for many years, these men lived with a strange kind of invisible heroism. They knew they'd done something important and dangerous and successful, but they couldn't talk about it. They'd helped win the war through deception and illusion, which doesn't fit neatly into traditional narratives of military heroism. There were no dramatic charges or last stands. There were artists inflating rubber tanks and playing sound effects in the French countryside while real battles happened just miles away. The Ghost Army proves that warfare isn't just about who has the biggest guns or the most soldiers. Sometimes it's about who can think most creatively. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that makes the enemy look in the wrong direction. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops didn't defeat the Nazis with rubber tanks and sound effects, but they certainly helped. They created confusion and doubt in German intelligence. They caused the Germans to waste resources defending against attacks that never came. They gave real American units the advantage of surprise and reduced opposition. And they did all of this with materials you could buy at a hardware store and skills learned in art school. That's the kind of victory that doesn't fit neatly into history books, but it's no less real for being unconventional.